Hi, welcome to Intro to Soc. We're going to be starting our unit 3, which is going to be on inequalities. So we're going to start first with social class. So this is the agenda for how it's going to look. So first we're going to talk a little bit about social stratification and systems. What is social class structure in the United States, socioeconomic status, what that means, kind of how we measure it, social mobility, what does that mean, how do we achieve it, and then we'll talk about poverty, so a little bit about how it's defined, what are some of the consequences of it. So first we're going to talk about social stratification. Now you might have heard this in some of your other classes. If you're going into the social sciences, it's likely that you'll hear this again. So society is structured based on a hierarchy of difference. Hopefully you can kind of remember back to when we talked about social position and social roles and how we tend to hold people of certain statuses high and we have a lot of expectations for them. Meanwhile, some other people we don't hold as high or consider their jobs as important. And we know from Marx that this is wrong, right? Everybody kind of has an essential role in society, but nevertheless, we are a very hierarchical and stratified society. So those who are deemed to be the most useful or prestigious are at the top. So we're talking people like celebrities, doctors, bankers, CEOs. Again, doesn't necessarily mean it's right. It's just kind of how it is right now. While those who are deemed least useful are kind of towards the bottom. So we've talked a little bit about people suffering from addiction, maybe down there. People who are ex-felons or have committed crime are probably down there too. So where you stand also depends on your race, your gender, education, religion, and other things like that. And since this is the inequality section, we'll be kind of building upon this throughout the quarter. So social stratification, its main definition that we're using for this class, the existence of a hierarchy in a society based on differences between people's economic resources. So that's going to be class, like we're talking about today, their gender, their race, ethnicity, and nationality. And you can also talk about other parts of identity like religion as well as ability versus disability. So it really builds upon one another. We'll keep talking about it later on. I'm sorry. Okay, so hopefully you can remember this again. Remember when we talked about status? Status is a degree of honor that's attributed to a certain person or a group in relation to others in society. Remember that there are two types of status. So you've got the ascribed status. The ascribed status, you're just kind of born into. It doesn't mean that you can't necessarily change it, but at that point, like right when you're born into it, there's not much you can do. So you can't really control that you were born into that. So these are things like sex, race, if you were born with a disability. You're also born into your parents' social class. Meanwhile, achieved status is what you achieve. You can change it. You're not born with it. It's something that you have to earn over time. So this is going to be education, occupation, and wealth. And sociologists argue that the statuses that you were born with or can't control do affect the chances that you have to earn more achieved statuses. And social stratification is the end result of these differences. So let's talk a little bit about the different stratification systems. We've seen a few in history, but there are three primary ones. So first, we've got slavery. Most of you are familiar with this. People are literally owned by other people and considered to be property. We have a caste system. A caste system means that you are kind of predetermined or born into a certain social class. You're very unlikely to move. It's just kind of rigid and fixed. So we don't really have that today, but it has been historically, it has occurred in history. And then we have class, which is what we have today. So class depends on your economic resources. It depends on what you have in order to let you achieve things like education, wealth, occupations, jobs, and it's not unchangeable. So we can kind of change class however we want to, depending on where you're at in the social structure, not the social position. It might be far more difficult for people to change their class than others. So what is social class? Social class is different from other types of socioeconomic structures like slavery and caste systems. Again, class is what we have right now. It's pretty fluid, right? So just because you're born into poverty, that doesn't necessarily mean you've got to stay that way. Even if you're not making a lot of money right now, it can change. It can go really well and you can start making a lot of money, or you can run into hard times and move down a class. So it's very fluid. It doesn't stay the same. It's partially achieved. So you're able to do things to move your social class around. So it's not totally fixed. It's not completely out of your control necessarily, although we are kind of constrained by whatever social conditions we are in at the time. It's economically based. So here class is determined by your monetary resources, which kind of determine your access to education and health and things like that you can imagine. Next, class is large scale, so it's very impersonal. It's not based on any sort of social duty or social ritual. It just kind of is. So how do we measure social class? This is kind of debatable, but for right now, we'll just kind of keep it simple. So where a person fits into their social class system depends on 5 different things. So it depends on income, wealth, educational attainment, occupational status, and lifestyle. So the people who share these things in common, so people who have similar wealth or educational attainment, they make up a certain social class. So one thing to remember is what's the difference between income and wealth? I didn't personally know this. It kind of took me a little bit of time to figure this out, but there is a difference. So income, that's what you get from your job. It's what you get from your paycheck. It's your wages, salaries, any money that you make from investment. Wealth is a little bit different. It's a little bit more broad and bigger. So it's all of your assets. So that includes all of your cash, all of your savings. If you have an inheritance, it would include this as well. It would include your investments in stocks and bonds, real estate. So if you are a homeowner, that's going to contribute to your wealth, but not necessarily your income. So there is kind of like a subtle difference that we need to keep in mind. Education is the #1 predictor of the future. So a person who is more highly educated is more likely to be wealthy. They're more likely to make a high income. And of course, this really depends on, what area they're working in, but this is just kind of generalized, very broad. Again, we're sociologists, so we're thinking in terms of trends and patterns. And education does shape what you decide to do for a job. It does shape your occupation and the opportunities that you have to get certain jobs. So while having an education doesn't necessarily guarantee that you'll be richer or necessarily have more status than others that do not, it does oftentimes pay off. And it is a pretty big predictor of future success. So occupational prestige, that just means how the degree of status that is bestowed upon the job that you are in. So hopefully you can kind of remember Durkheim's division of labor. He argued that as societies grow in complexity, it's no longer possible for one person to take care of everybody, to do all the jobs. There's going to be lots of different people with a lot of different needs. So we need everybody to kind of have a part in society to serve the needs of everyone. We are socialized to perceive some jobs as more prestigious, meaning more important and more valuable than others, even though we need them all. Hopefully you can remember back to our exercise where we talked a little bit about when we place more value on a CEO than we might a janitor. So if companies are looking for somebody to cut, they're most likely going to go for the janitor because their job is perceived as being less important and less valuable, even though we know that they're completely essential. So we tend to give prestige to jobs that require more education. So the more alphabet soup you have behind your name, that's considered to be more prestigious, have more status. We give more prestige to jobs that provide a public service. So we like people like doctors and lawyers, philanthropists, and we also tend to give prestige to jobs that have fame. So that's kind of why we value celebrities. Celebrities aren't any better than any one of us, but a lot of the times their work and their lifestyle is viewed as more important than other people's because of that. So lifestyle. So in addition to educational attainment, income, wealth, and occupational prestige, where a person fits in that social class system depends on their lifestyle. And essentially all a lifestyle is how people spend their time and how they spend their money. So this can be on things like clothes, dining, leisure, cars, homes, and pets. So the things that we buy, the things that we wear, and the things that we do, as well as the places that we travel, the things that we eat, the places that we go to hang out, they're becoming really more important in how we're perceived and treated. So back when we watched that Black Mirror episode, how she ate, the home that she bought, the car that she drives, it gives them a level of prestige and status. So that does kind of determine their social class as well. So we're starting to see that even in our own society, certainly. So next we're going to talk a little bit about economic status. You've probably, socioeconomic status, you've probably heard this term before, you'll likely encounter it again. So a person's socioeconomic status is a culmination of all of these elements that we use to measure social class. So it's a culmination of income, wealth, education, occupational prestige, and lifestyle. So when you put all those together and combine them, it's kind of what you get. So social scientists argue that a person's socioeconomic status is really important because it can affect their health. So of course, the more access to money, the more access to homes, the more that people treat your job as important, the way the comfort of your lifestyle can influence your health, both physical and mental. It can influence how much you can give your children in terms of educational opportunities, and it can influence your degree of political influence. So people who are more connected to certain politicians, those who are able to donate more to certain campaigns, those who are more highly educated are going to have a little bit more of a political influence than other people, which isn't necessarily right, of course, but it's just kind of the way it is right now. So this is just a general overview of the class structure in the US. So up at the top, we've got the upper class, the super rich, then we've got the middle to upper class, the lower middle class. This is where most of us fall. This is where the majority is. So we're not necessarily super rich, but we're pretty comfortable. Below that is the working class. That's kind of people who, they're doing all right, kind of penny pinching, maybe living pretty close to paycheck. And then there's the working poor. So they truly are living paycheck to paycheck. And then there's underclass. And these are people who virtually have no income at all. They're living far below the poverty line. So when we talked about the homeless population, this would include them. So here's just an overview. I'm not going to go through these in a whole lot of detail, so feel free to pause them and take a look. I just kind of went through and gave you a definite example of what these class systems would look like in terms of the way we're measuring social class. So for the super rich, what does they look like for occupations, income and wealth, education and lifestyle? So I just went through and did that for each of these. Feel free to pause them and take a look, but I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on those during recorded lecture. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about social mobility. So all social mobility means is that we're able to move from the class that we're currently in to a different one. Now again, that can go up or down. So a person who is super rich might, hit some bad times, might run into bankruptcy and move themselves down a notch. So social mobility just can go either direction, up or down. It just kind of depends on where we're transitioning in terms of class. So a class system makes it possible for people to move upwards or downwards in a society. Again, this is different from the caste system that's pretty static, pretty stuck, pretty rigid. So there's not much you can do to move there. Slavery, there's not much you can do. But in the class system, it is possible to move up or down. There are two types of social mobility that sociologists recognize. The first is intergenerational. So for intergenerational mobility, this just means that you were able to move either up or down from the social class that your parents or your grandparents are in. So it's just a difference in how class changes throughout the family line. And then intragenerational is that social mobility that happens throughout a person's working life. So if you start out poor and make your way up to the super rich, then that would be intergenerational. So next, let's talk a little bit about poverty. I'm sure most of you have a general idea what poverty is. It's certainly something that's probably going to come up in most of your careers. It's very hard to avoid, unfortunately. So how do we define it? There's really not a clear definition of poverty. It's just gotten so complex, and the effects are so complex. But the definition does kind of continue to expand and change as we're starting to see what it means to be truly impoverished. We are starting to see that being in poverty is far more than just a lack of money or a lack of economic resources, which we'll kind of talk about. So it does expand beyond that. It might include a lack of overall health, supportive relationships, social knowledge. Again, that social knowledge tells us how to belong into a society. So some people who are in poverty don't have as great of an idea of what it means to abide by norms and values. And all these things are required to live successfully. So people living in poverty do have a very hard time. So what's social capital? So, social capital, according to the definition, is basically the amount of economic and non economic resources made available to an individual based on their ability to network and form relationships with people who provide them with a sense of empowerment. So, feeling like they can get on their own 2 feet, make their own decisions, make good decisions for themselves, be confident in those decisions, safety and security, belonging to a community or to a family, and have a good grip on the knowledge of norms and values of a society. So, social capital is basically saying that who you know matters to your success. So, the most successful people are connected to other people who give them this sense of belonging, empowerment, comfort, and social knowledge. Low income individuals are less likely to have these types of positive relationships. Why? Well, sometimes, if you are living paycheck to paycheck, you're always working, so you really don't have a lot of time to connect with other people or to get involved with community resources that can help you get a boost. Sometimes people who are in poverty are suffering from mental illness or maybe facing addiction or involved in some illegal activities, which doesn't necessarily give you the things that you need to advance. Successful children often come from homes that make them feel safe, encouraged, and loved. This shouldn't be surprising to us. Meanwhile, poor children often, but not always, come from homes that are unstable. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, jobs might turn over, evictions might happen, so they're constantly moving in and out of homelessness, in and out of different homes, different schools. It can be scary for some people because due to the stress of what's going on with job loss and homelessness, there can be some instances of family violence. So children don't feel that sense of safety and security even in their own homes. And they don't, if they're switching schools all the time, they haven't really had that chance to form those bonds that they need to with school officials and teachers that can help them feel safe and give them a sense of comfort or somebody that they can turn to. So they just don't have that. Children from poor families can also experience neglect. So sometimes there's no provision of basic needs, or it's extremely lacking, even though it's kind of there. So, of course, poor kids might not have enough food. They don't have clean or new clothing. They might not have shelter if they're moving in and out of homelessness. Again, this isn't necessarily true of all children living in poverty. It's just some of those risks that can happen if you are. It might help to explain why successful children are able to get ahead and tend to be from higher socioeconomic statuses because they are able to build this social capital due to stronger bonds, a more stable home environment. So there's 2 types of poverty that we recognize. So the first is relative poverty. So relative poverty means that you're basically poor compared to everybody else around you, or you're rich compared to everybody else around you. So relative poverty is measured according to the living standards of a given community or in a given society. So somebody who is rich in Manhattan, Kansas might be considered poor when they're out in Beverly Hills or Nantucket. So it's all relative. It kind of depends on who's around you, and we kind of judge by those standards. Absolute poverty, though, is you are poor by any standards of any society. So absolute poverty means you don't have the ability to provide for basic needs. So food, clothing, shelter. You need all of these things to survive anywhere. So there are 2 different types of poverty that we're looking at. So who is at risk for poverty? I'm going to go over this very briefly. Again, we're going to be talking about gender and race and ethnicity throughout this section 2 in the next couple of weeks. So this will kind of just be a general overview, but we'll get more into why this is. So technically speaking, basically anybody can experience poverty. We kind of learned that when we looked at that video of the homeless folks who were sharing their story. Some of them are doing just fine, encountered an accident or a medical emergency, or went through a traumatic divorce, and it just kind of flipped their lives upside down. So it can really happen to anybody at any point in their lives. However, there are some social groups that are at higher risk than others. Again, we're sociologists, so we're looking at patterns and trends. We're doing kind of what Durkheim did with this study on suicides. So we're looking at people who are just more prone to living in poverty, and we're trying to kind of figure out why. So some of the groups that are racial and ethnic minorities. Women are more likely to be in poverty. We'll talk a little bit about why that might be next week. Children, obviously, they can't do a whole lot to control the situation that they're born into. And I mean, if they can't work, there's not really anything they can do at that point. People who are elderly are likely to be in poverty, as well as people who are disabled. Social stigmas, meaning those negative thoughts and perceptions about these groups and their abilities, might make it harder for them to get the resources they need. So hopefully you can remember back, we tend to make assumptions about what people need, how they feel, what their abilities are, and sometimes that can be really, really harmful. So we do need to keep those in mind to kind of be aware of those, our own social stigmas that we have, even if it's not necessarily conscious, maybe in our subconscious, but we need to be really aware about how we're interacting with the people that we're working with, to give them the best chance at getting good services from us. So what are the consequences of poverty? Poverty is not necessarily impossible to escape, but it's really, really difficult. It really binds people down. So poverty compounds upon itself. So if you are a person with poor social knowledge, it makes it hard to make beneficial connections. You know, if you don't know how to behave in public, people aren't going to want to hang out with you. So kids who smell, kids who don't have good transportation because their parents are working or don't have a car, or they can't bring a gift to birthday parties, they're way less likely to be invited again, or to connect with other children, or to be welcomed, unfortunately. Poor families can't necessarily afford to put their kids in activities. So this hinders their opportunity to make connections with other kids as well as other adults in the form of coaches. If you can't get into activities that could potentially lead to scholarships, that kind of puts a damper on your chances of going to college. Minor illness can turn into chronic illness if left untreated. Minor drug and alcohol use, you know, to just kind of deal with the stressors of the day or to deal with depression, can really turn into addiction pretty quick. Petty crime, we talked about this when we talked about deviance and conformity. Petty crime can turn into a criminal record. So if you just get picked up one time, a boss is going to see that and not want to hire you regardless of what the offense was, no matter how minor it is. It's still on your record, so it's going to be even harder to get jobs. You'll be turned away from scholarships, so you can't get an education. People aren't going to want to allow you to rent from them, so it's going to decrease your chances of maintaining a home or getting a rental signed. So it really does compound upon itself and can cause some really serious damage. That's what makes it so hard to get out of poverty. So that is it for social class. Again, we'll be talking about gender and race coming up here in the next couple of weeks, so we can kind of tie all of this together. But hopefully this gives you a little bit more of an idea of what social class is. Again, I kind of sped through this. I know most of you are pretty familiar with what socioeconomic status is and what social class is. So I think that we should be pretty strong here. So contact me anytime if you've got questions about this. I would be happy to help you. Have a good week.